Elden Ring Nightreign is just a little bit weird, but I think it's weird in a way that is going to change up some of the industry as we move forward. Now, in case you're not really aware, basically, Fromsoft went and followed up one of the biggest single-player games of the decade with a PvE roguelite RPG with procedurally generated map, battle royale elements, even predetermined hero characters with ultimates, and all designed around 3-player co-op. Which is a little bit weird. It's a departure, and I can get why so many people looked at it and thought, is this just an asset flip cash grab? But here's where it's interesting, right? The dust has settled, the patches have rolled out, and actually sentiment has changed with this game. So yes, it reuses a lot of assets, but assets are only one small part of a game. Fromsoft clearly knows that. It's actually why they've done so many cool things with this game. But I think Fromsoft are just about the only people that could have gotten away with a launch like the launch that this game had. And I have a little sneaky suspicion that a lot of AAAs are perhaps going to learn the wrong lessons. I've also got big news for the thousands of you who have visited and used our sponsor, Boot.dev. And that news is TypeScript. If you know what that means, you know it's pretty huge. The entire backend learning path is now playable in TypeScript as well as Go. It's funny, Lane, the founder's tweet, basically just reads, "Fine, you win, we've capitulated to the way of soy because enums." And if you're wondering why you should care, well, TypeScript is Microsoft's vastly more powerful JavaScript, static types, fearless refactors, editor autocompletion, lots of lovely things, which is why Google, Slack, and Airbnb use it in production. It lets you catch bugs while you're coding instead of, when the server's on fire. TypeScript's awesome. Now, Boot.dev wraps all of that in the power of an RPG. That means quests, XP, boss fights, real-time leaderboards, community, all of that. You get to enjoy that while you're wiring up databases, building REST APIs, deploying to the cloud, and now doing all that with TypeScript. And by the time you finish your learning path, you will have a portfolio full of back-end projects. You'll have the confidence to dual-wield TypeScript and Go in any gig, which is going to be huge for employers. And there's a bit of a hack to save you the most money. Boot.dev/Bellular News, code Bellular News gets you 25% off with your first purchase. But what you can do is buy the yearly plan for the largest saving, because, 25% of a bigger number is a bigger number. And if you don't gel with it, well, just use the no-risk 30-day money-back guarantee. Okay, so here's how the game went down, right? They revealed it in December, dropped it in May, and it's essentially built from Elden Ring's combat, map, and enemies, plus a bunch of Dark Souls assets. So if you want to talk about a AAA asset flip, this game really would be that. And here's what also made people a bit suspicious. Bandai Namco was still publishing it. Now, this was after From Software got the Elden Ring IP back. So many people kind of speculated that this game was perhaps some sort of weird publisher obligation, which I think just reflects that people were skeptical. And rightly skeptical. A lot of goofy stuff happens in this industry. But here's the thing. This is exactly what audiences are kind of craving for right now. People may not say it, but based on the actual numbers, this seems to be what people play. And to kind of get data there, we can look at Newzoo's 2025 gaming report. That does tell us something interesting. PvE games have taken up more and more audience time in 2024. And if you look at PC gamers specifically, right? In 2021, 47% of us were in PvE, but in 2024, that has actually jumped to 58%. I've got to imagine that Helldivers helped quite a bit there. But even before Nightreign was a thing, we kind of already knew that Elden Ring fans wanted this sort of thing, and the reason why is simple. Literally, the most downloaded mod on Nexus Mods is Seamless Co-op. It's got 9.3 million unique downloads. That kind of shows that people do want seamless co-op, and I think nothing proves this more than what happened at launch. A lot was said about this game's launch, but one thing I think we can't say is that people didn't want it, because it actually sold 3.5 million copies in a week. That's a shitload of money, pretty incredible. But obviously it did not land for everyone like Elden Ring did, and that is reflected in the scores here. So check the recommendation ratings on OpenCritic. What do you see? 98% recommend for Elden Ring, a 78% recommend for Nightreign. And every review comes with caveats, and not just ones that are there because it's a multiplayer game. The core design is different from Elden Ring. Not every Elden Ring player will like it. And it wasn't the usual phenomenon where a game comes out, gets fairly low reviews, but then for whatever reason it sort of ticks up over the next day in a major fashion. No, here they actually did stay mixed through the weekend. It was a caustic game, and I really can see why. Like, at launch, the single player was almost unplayable. It was really hard. The communication tools were also fairly miserable. The matchmaking was broken. Players were frustrated by lack of duo options, no balance for two-player teams either, and a whole bunch of things. Now, in a way, right, that's kind of weird because this is a game from Software. If there was some sort of option that you would crave, the response would be, well, sorry, that's not how we've made our game. It's also, Bandai Namco, they were responsible for the very overt Git Gud based marketing. And that's the marketing that spent, I'm so glad we're kind of over with it, but the tireless, endless debates about difficulty options, about how putting an easy mode in there would be destroying the developer's intent, which, to be honest, I do kind of agree with personally. But anyway, whenever Nightreign released, a lot of the critiques sounded familiar. A lot of people wanted certain features, certain accommodations. They were not there. In a way, it was almost identical to some of the complaints we've seen from Marathon of very specific features, maybe genre expectations that seemed very important to fans, but clearly were not particularly important to the developers making the game. Now, in this case, things have kind of changed as the game is shaken out and the meta's developed. The Steam score has improved. It's improved massively. It's back to mostly positive. It's actually been ticking up and up. It may be even more positive by the time you see this video. And I think we can be sure that FromSoftware doing something they don't usually do had an impact there. And it was them doing patches. They massively rebalanced the loot provisioning in the game. They fixed matchmaking. They made single player viable. And of course, as they did that, people actually got to grips with what Nightreign actually offers. But what initially tipped people over, right? What that was the difference in intent between this game and Elden Ring. Elden Ring made the FromSoftware formula fairly approachable. The game's open world and how that worked with the progression design certainly helped. So how could the minds behind Elden Ring, a game that is punishing but actually ended up being mass market appeal levels of accessible, manage to create something so very different? Alright, so at the risk of stating the obvious, Nightreign is a bit of an experiment from FromSoft, but not really in just it being a new genre. And that's actually a lot of the reason why we wanted to make this video. The director Junya Ishikaze spoke with Famitsu about creating the game, and that's where it got kind of interesting. So this guy was a combat designer on Elden Ring, right? From combat designer to director. And the way this game went down, right, is that in 2021, just before Elden Ring launched, he pitched this concept, right, to Hidetaka Miyazaki, who is the president of FromSoft and, the man, the big legend that everybody knows from that company. So from there, the team basically worked on it as a side project. And yes, they reused almost like all of the assets that they could to save development time, basically so they could put all of their effort into the game design and the structure of this. Because, well, they had loads of assets. They didn't need to remake everything from scratch, which of course explains all the asset reuse. Now, of course, you're a skeptical audience. You look at this and think, are you just trying to save a buck? But I don't really think it's like that in this case. I mean, why would you make that choice? Yes, on one side it could be to save money, but here's the key. Miyazaki asked him to be the director of the project, right? A combat designer wanted to make a game about combat, with hyper-fast progression, with boss fights, all that stuff. So by doing this, they just got to focus on what actually mattered for the game that they were trying to make. And because it's overtly an Elden Ring spin-off, not some, full-scale AAA game, it doesn't really have the burden of those insane expectations. And most importantly, Miyazaki wasn't directing. And that is humongous if you're a company like that, especially so if you know their history. So get a load of this. In the last decade, they've made 8 games, which is insane. They are so goddamn productive. Now, Miyazaki directed 6 of those games. Now, let's compare that to the previous decade. In that previous decade, he directed 4 out of 26 games. 26! That's a lot. Obviously, games aren't just made by their directors. We do talk about the big names like your Kojimas, your Miyazakis, perhaps your Druckmanns, like they're everything, like they have all of this brand awareness, which is true, but they don't make everything. But still, directors do have a lot of influence, and I think most importantly, they bear a hell of a lot of responsibility. Now, when was the last Dark Souls game that Miyazaki didn't direct? It was a bunch of years ago in a game called Dark Souls 2. He was only supervising for that game. Dark Souls 2 is widely seen as the most divisive Dark Souls game. But in this case, it's not a sequel, it's a spin-off in a new genre with asset reuse to keep the costs minimal. That's smart in a bunch of ways. The team can focus on what they want to do, but also for the business, well, the risk of a poorly received game was kind of minimal there because it was a spin-off. If it was a total disaster, that would be that. They wouldn't really have lost that much money and they could just truck on and not really do that mistake again. People probably would have forgotten and forgiven. But there's something else that would expand regardless, and it's what we don't talk about enough here. It's fairly simple. It's the experience of From Software staff, because they just went and did something new. Cultivating talent matters, and we know that because Miyazaki's talked about it. So when Erdtree released last year, he spoke about how the studio had developed, and here's what he said. Through developing Elden Ring, I think a lot of our talent benefited. Directors who are not me, game designers, game planners who aren't the core team. It served as a foundation for us to build upon, to grow into the next stage as a company. That's where it gets kind of interesting, because if FromSoft is basically just games directed by Miyazaki, what happens if, you don't really have him around? What happens if he loses his spark? What happens if he leaves, gets sick? It would be a real problem. So Nightreign is essentially proof of that, of new leadership, new tools, new systems, all of these things that a spin-off let them develop. And most importantly for the long run, a willingness to take chances on a senior developer's ideas. So senior developers actually feel like they can go and make something cool in this company, rather than just, always be working under Miyazaki, where they won't perhaps get responsibility if they maybe crave more. That actually matters for keeping people at a studio. And several industry trends are at play here. I mean, first off, smaller games give developers room to experiment, and building at an Elden Ring's success just means that players will give it a chance. People will know its name. It's freed from the burden of being a full AAA game, but still attached to something that people know, which, funnily enough, is a big difference between Marathon and Nightreign. By Marathon being, itself, not a spin-off, it really has far higher expectations, ones that Bungie quite obviously didn't meet. Second then, new leadership means fresh ideas. It can also reduce bottlenecks. So many stories that we've seen have basically boiled down to big leadership bottlenecks stifling entire teams for months. What that means here is that not every From Software game has got to go through Miyazaki, and do you know what the end result of that will be? Growth. New games, more games. It'll mean the company won't stagnate, just having to make the same thing again and again and again. It means staff will be creatively fulfilled, that they won't take their talent elsewhere because they actually feel like it can be used internally. And if the sort of thing that you want is basically just a Miyazaki game, the likes of this existing frees up time pressure for them to actually be able to cook, rather than that being the only pillar that holds the company up. It's one of those strange things. So many developers would not get away with this because they're not FromSoft, right? Because they haven't built up that goodwill and really cultivated such diehard fans. In a way, though, I think Nightreign being divisive and rough at its launch does actually mean that FromSoft are going to be kept on their toes, that they won't be resting on their laurels. And big picture, I do actually see this being long-term good for the studio. I have a feeling there's a lot of Western studios that we'll be able to contrast this with. So, here what we basically see is FromSoft giving their next generation of leaders a chance, trying to build something new internally. That means risk, that takes time, but you know what? It's important. And to me, it just seems this is a studio that has actually worked out how to cultivate talent, how to really do those things that it seems so many of the big Western studios have kind of failed to do. And all while not having 6-year-long development cycles that are absolute literal hell for the staff that seemingly involves the game being rebooted 2 or 3 times. They clearly just do things different, and I think what we're seeing here with Nightreign is a bit of a manifestation of that. And yes, it was messy, but I think in many ways this is the best side of a asset flip. You can call Tears of the Kingdom an asset flip because it uses the same Hyrule, but it turns out that by using the same Hyrule, they were just able to cook on the actual game bit, which funnily enough is what we play. Now, I can completely imagine a lot of other studios looking at this, seeing it as quick buck, low-hanging fruit, and not really understanding the full point of the exercise. But that doesn't take away from how this is pretty damn good, and how this is one of the most impressive studios that this industry's, I think, ever produced. There is another studio though, and in the time it took for them to make the game that has got them so big right now, I think FromSoft probably shipped like, I don't know, 5 or 6 games. It's Arrowhead. And what they've pulled off recently in Helldivers is worth you knowing about. You can learn all about it in the next video.